Ladies and gentlemen who are watching this program on Zoom, we'll begin in just a moment. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for a very special lecture by Dr. Robert Goodby. We'll be joining you with unmuted audio in just a few moments.
Well, welcome everyone. We're so happy to have Dr. Robert Goodby here to present on his new book. Dr. Goodby teaches anthropology and archaeology at Franklin Pierce University, and he's got a wealth of experience and knowledge of the regional archaeology, both in an academic role and as a consultant in the region. So we'd like to welcome him to talk a little bit about his book.
Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone who's in the room. Thank you, everybody on Zoom. Thanks to Vic and everyone with the MAS for inviting me down, and in doing so, showing some support for this project I've been working on. So I'm very happy to be here. So yeah, my name is Bob Goodby, and I am an archaeologist, and I have been doing this for a long time. When I look back on it, it's something I fell in love with when I was an undergraduate at the University of New Hampshire in the mid-1980s. And I first fell in love with anthropology, and then about a year after that, fell in love with archaeology when I had a chance to work on a Native American site up by Lake Winnipesaukee. And I've been doing it ever since. I've done all my work on native sites in New England, most of it in New Hampshire, but I have done a fair amount of work down in this area as well. I went to graduate school in Rhode Island, and so spent 6 years of my life down here in the southeastern Massachusetts area. So that's sort of who I am. And as a professional archaeologist, I've done what all of us are supposed to do. I do digs. I sometimes find interesting and significant sites, and then eventually I get around to writing them up and publishing them in an archaeological journal, because that's part of the game. You've got to get your reports out there. And as we're being trained in this funny business, we're trained very specifically in how you do this sort of research and how you report the sort of research, writing technical scientific papers, embracing all the latest archaeological theory and let's be honest, all the latest archaeological jargon, and getting out a paper that your colleagues can understand. And so I've done that for many, many years, but I had never written a book. And as I had accumulated experience in archaeology, my wife said, you know, you really ought to write a book. And I said, yeah, I should. And time went on, and then just this past year, I had the sort of coincidence both with the COVID shutdown, and I also had a year of sabbatical from Franklin Pierce University. I said, okay, this is it. This is the time to write a book. And so I did. And what I want to do today is I want to tell sort of at least a two-part story, maybe a 2.5-part story. But it's a story about the book. I was asked to come talk about the book, and I'm happy to do that. And as I do that, I'm also going to talk about the archaeological work I've done in the Monadnock region of southwestern New Hampshire. So I'll show you some pictures of sites and artifacts and things of that sort. But then it's also, there's an element of this that became sort of autobiographical as well. And I'll sort of develop that as I go on. So that is the title of my book. The book was officially released 2 months ago today on Indigenous Peoples Day. And so it has been out in the world for 60 days. And it has been a very enjoyable experience to have something like this. So let's sort of start at the beginning. This is not a book for a dozen of my colleagues. This is not a book written in technical jargon. It is not what would be called a scholarly or academic book. This is not the kind of book that's going to get anybody tenure at Harvard. And that's not the book that I intended to write. One of the things that I have thought for a long time is that as archaeologists, we do all sorts of very important scientific technical work, and that's the foundation of our discipline. But we also almost always have remarkable stories to tell. And the stories are of interest not just to us, they're of interest to all kinds of people. People love archaeology. But if you go to college and university and graduate school to be an archaeologist, the odds are pretty good that no one is ever going to train you to speak to anyone other than your peers. That's not how you get ahead. That's not how you get promotion, tenure. It's not how you get your PhD. And so we sort of leave that behind. And in doing so, we can sometimes give up on some very interesting stories. Now, as I was thinking back on it, I've actually been telling stories for quite a while about archaeology. And one of the first ones I thought about it as I was driving back down here, because I used to, live down in this part of the world and haven't been here for a long time. And I was driving back down and thinking about the first time that I came to what was then the Bronson Museum, the forerunner of the Robbins Museum. And the way that worked out, I was a graduate student, first-year graduate student at Brown University, and I was focusing on Native American sites. And one of my professors, Richard Gould, called me into his office one day. And he was my advisor, and I was a first-year graduate student. And he said, Bob, I just found out that the Rhode Island School of Design is looking for people to give gallery talks to the public on different aspects of archaeology. And I said, oh, that's nice. I'm not sure I'd be really good at that. I think I'll probably take a pass on that. Silence grew. I said, oh, okay, I'd be happy to do that, okay? So I began to think about that, okay? How do I talk to an audience of non-specialists, people who just sort of wander in and want to know something about local archaeology? And it was also at the Rhode Island School of Design at their museum, so it's art, it's images and things of that sort. So what am I going to do? I'm a New England archaeologist. What am I going to talk about? And the first thing I thought was, well, I need some pictures of something. I need some images of things that come close to being artistic. And I had heard about the Bronson Museum and knew a little bit about their collection. And so I made an appointment, came up, met the late Maurice Robbins, got a signed copy of his Wampanoag book, and spent the afternoon taking photographs of some of the more artistic objects in the collection, some of which I've seen today for the first time in all those years. And I went and I gave my gallery talk, and I had a blast. And I was talking in the first person, and I was, offering some interpretations of these objects. I was interacting with the audience, asking what they thought about them, and had a really good time. And that was sort of the beginning of it. But I really got serious about this about 15 years ago. In New Hampshire, we have a wonderful organization called New Hampshire Humanities, and they're the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And one of the many programs they have is a program called Humanities to Go. And what that does is it provides funding so that local organizations can pay a scholar, a performer, an artist, somebody, a musician, to come and do a talk or do a performance. And I have been part of this program for 15 years. And in that time, I have given, I don't have an accurate count. It's got to be 300 talks at least in venues all around the state. I do 2 talks for New Hampshire Humanities. One is called Digging into Native History in New Hampshire. And that's sort of a broad overview of the archaeology and what it's like to work on native sites in that part of the world. And then the second talk I do for them, it's called 12,000 Years Ago in the Granite State. And this is all focused on a remarkable Paleoindian site that we discovered in Keene, New Hampshire back in 2009. And in these talks, this is a picture of me this summer giving a talk in a beautiful old colonial meeting house in North Sutton, New Hampshire. It really was very nice, aside from the fact that it was about 104 degrees in the room. But I've given these talks all over to historical societies, libraries, school groups. I even gave a talk once at the New Hampshire State Prison in Berlin. And it's an opportunity to bring what I do as a professional archaeologist to a public audience and to talk about it in a different way. And I'll be quite upfront about it. I discovered very quickly I like doing it that way better than I like going to a professional conference and reading the papers that we're supposed to read. And so that's what this book is inspired by. This book is written as I give those talks. It's mostly in the first person. It's a narrative sort of presentation, and it's meant to be accessible for a wide range of people. So that's how I got started. Now, this is something that, again, hasn't traditionally gotten you rewards in archaeology, but it's something that we're beginning to talk about. And as I started the book, I just stumbled on, I had, a pile of newsletters I never got around to reading. And one of them was a fairly recent one from the SAA Archaeological Record. And there was the title of the talk: Come, Let Me Tell You a Tale, Writing for the Wider Audience. And so this is an article in the Professional Archaeological Newsletter about how we need to get out there and do this. And there are all sorts of good reasons, practical reasons for doing this. One is that we rely on public support for our work in all kinds of ways. And if we share the results of what we do with the public, they're going to be supportive of us. So it's in our self-interest to make this research accessible. And another issue here is that if we don't do that, because people are interested in archaeology, they love it. And if we don't do that and get out there and tell stories, the Ancient Aliens crowd is going to walk right into that vacuum and take over. Okay. And that's not what we want, because as you know, our stories are a lot more interesting than that. Yeah. So there are all sorts of good reasons to do this. And I'm hoping and thinking this is going to become more of a trend in archaeological writing and presentation. So almost everything I talked about in this book is in some way connected to my work as a professor at Franklin Pierce University. For those who don't know, Franklin Pierce is a small, traditionally a liberal arts school in southern New Hampshire, right on the New Hampshire-Massachusetts border in the Monadnock region. And almost everything I talk about here, it was either an outgrowth of a field school that I did with my Franklin Pierce students, or a dig that included my Franklin Pierce students. So there's a real theme of this, and I want to give credit there. Also, a lot of the things that I draw on for this, the technical papers that I published and then sort of reworked to be in this book, have co-authors who were some of my students. And so there's really a very strong connection there. So I have a sabbatical. I have things to write about. I have a wife who's an English professor who's been telling me I should do this, so there are no longer any excuses. And when September came along, this would be September of 2020, and I sat down and said, okay, I'm going to write a book. What do I do? Okay, I'll go ask my wife. And she's a writer, an English professor. And I said, so what's my first step? And she said, what you need is a scaffold, which is writer's speak, I guess, for a framework for the book. What the different parts are going to be, how the different parts connect to each other, and that will provide you some guidance as you go through the writing process. So I said, yeah, that makes sense. And I sat down with a legal pad and jotted out what it was I wanted to talk about. And really pretty much that legal pad became the table of contents for the book. And so that part was fairly easy. And I have a picture here from downtown Keene. We had this wonderful project that was done about 4 years ago or so, called the Wall Dogs Mural Project. And what it did was it had a team of professional graphic artists come in and paint beautiful historic murals on a lot of the old brick buildings downtown. And so we have one on the Abenaki, right off Central Square in Keene, and within sight of a millinery shop that was run by Margaret Sedekis, one of the Abenaki Sedekis family in Keene in the early 20th century. And there I have a picture of the mural with a scaffold in front of it. So there you go. So this part was fairly easy. And then I began to write, and that part worked pretty well too. I just sat down and I wrote like I speak, and out it came. And within a couple of months, I had a manuscript. And I started pulling together the maps and the pictures and all that sort of thing. I said, well, this is going really, really well. Now I have to get the darn thing published. Okay. And never having written a book, I was not really familiar with the realities of modern day publishing. I learned a lot. And those realities have changed significantly. The old model that might even have applied 15 or 20 years ago was, you write a book, you shop it around, you find a publisher who says, this is a great book, Bob, we're going to publish it. And then you do it. But there have been a lot of changes in the publishing industry. Book sales are way down. And unless you are a commercially established, successful author, publishers are very reluctant to take a risk on you because they don't want to be stuck with a bunch of books they can't sell. And so what has become a rule in many parts of the publishing industry is for, and I didn't know this going into this, but is for a practice called subvention. That's the technical term for it. And subvention means that the author has to bring in financial backing for the project. Now, this is not the same as a vanity press, because the publisher still wants to publish good things and maintain their reputation if you have a good publisher, but they're not going to take the financial risk. So the author has to come in with this funding. It was a very different landscape. I mean, when I first started writing this, I thought, okay, this is going to be a great book for University Press of New England to publish. Only they went out of business. Okay? And the University of Massachusetts Press still exists, and they have an imprint that does books for a wider audience, and they require subvention. So this was going to be a rule, and that really brought me up against my first hurdle. Where am I going to find the money to produce this book? And I ruled out bake sales. I'm not that good a cook, and I'm not tech savvy enough to. Someone said you should do a GoFundMe campaign. It's like I still have a track phone. I don't think that's going to work. And then it occurred to me that in my 20 plus years of working in the Monadnock region, I had worked with some outstanding nonprofit groups. I had done teachers workshops, talks, all sorts of things with them. And so I approached them. And two in particular, the Harris Center for Conservation Education is a remarkable organization that owns thousands of acres of land in the Monadnock region, manages it ecologically, and does nature education in schools throughout the region. And the second organization, the Historical Society of Cheshire County, is based in Keene, and they're sort of the central historical society for that part of New Hampshire. And so I approached both of them with the idea, and they said, yeah, let us see a manuscript. Both organizations were not interested in publishing a scholarly work that was going to be really super technical. So I gave them the manuscript, with my fingers crossed, and they liked it. And both of them said, we're on board. And so now I had the backing to actually produce the project. And I got some support also from my employer, Franklin Pierce University. And then the search was on to find a publisher. And I had one already in the back of my mind, a publisher who had done a book I'd had an article in many years before. Peter Randall Publisher is based in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They're a small independent publisher. And one of the things they specialize in are illustrated books on local history. And I said, okay, this is a pretty good fit. And they do very high quality graphics and things of that sort. So I said, this is a good fit. I contacted them, sent it off, and the publisher, Deirdre Randall, she liked it. And so all of this sort of came together. I was on the way to having a book. So that was exciting. Now, one of the issues here, though, great, you're going to publish a book. As I was thinking about publishing with Peter Randall, I had a colleague in the area who had also published a book with them, a wonderful book about an ancestor of hers who'd gone on one of these Arctic whaling expeditions that gets stranded in the ice. It's really quite a tale. And so I called her up. I said, how did you like working with Peter Randall? She said, oh, they were great. They did a wonderful job with the book. And then she sort of hesitated. I said, what's the matter? And she said, I have 1,000 copies in my basement. Okay. Haven't been able to sell them. Now, so one of the questions going into this was, how many copies should we have produced? Because depending on the number of copies you have printed, the cost per copy is cheaper. The more you get, the lower the cost per copy. But then you run the risk of, having my poor granddaughters clean out Grandpa Bob's moldering book pile in the basement. So we were a little leery about that. But we had three basic options for the first run: 1,000, 1,500, or 2,000. The folks at the Historical Society said, I think there's going to be some interest in this in the region. Let's go for it. So we went and had 2,000 copies published. Okay? And the book came out right before October 11th, Indigenous Peoples Day. And so there you have it. So one of the things about the book, and as I was doing this, as everyone here knows, archaeology is a very visual discipline. We need to be able to see the things that we're writing about and thinking about and talking about. That's why it's such a treat to give a talk in this kind of setting where we're surrounded by all these incredible artifacts. But if you're writing about artifacts, you want the reader to be able to see them. And you want to be able to, I wanted them to be able to see them well. That means high quality color images, and a lot of them. And that, more than any other factor, drives up the cost of the book. But we wanted to go for it. So the book has over 60 images, all very nicely done. And it includes all kinds of things on this one here, because of course I'm writing about the southern part of the traditional homeland of the Western Abenaki people, the land they call Indakina. And one of the things the Abenaki are renowned for are their beautiful ash splint baskets, particularly the way they start making them in the 19th century, as you see in this really beautiful example right here. And then on the other end of the time spectrum, this is a fluted point, dating probably 11 to 12,000 years old. And again, the reader needs to be able to see these images and see them clearly. And on the cover of the book, I have had the privilege of working with a local art teacher at Keene Middle School, Miranda Nelkin, who is a great artist and illustrator. And she did this beautiful illustration, her rendition of what the Paleoindian site that was discovered before the middle school was constructed might have looked like. So the book has a lot of pictures, and that affects the cost. That's one of the realities. I did, as a first-time author, I was more than a little bit insecure about this book. And I was thinking, oh, what if nobody likes it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been with some interest that I've watched the response to it. One of the places you get a response, as I'm sure you know, is on Amazon. So people can review it on Amazon, and then you can go and you can see how many stars it gets, okay, out of 5. And I got my first review, it was 5 stars. Okay, then I got a second and a third and a fourth, and they were all 5 stars. And then I checked one day, and my 5-star rating had dropped to 4 stars. I said, oh goodness, somebody didn't like it. And I scrolled down to see what the comment was. It was a brief comment. They gave me 1 star. Okay, and the first sentence, only a 2-sentence comment. The first sentence was, I haven't actually seen this book yet, period. But $28 is too much for a paperback, okay? But that is part of the reality, and so that's what I went for. And the pictures are a really important part of this. And so this is the structure of the book. And as I was writing it, and I'm writing in the first person for the most part, I realized after a little while, yeah, do you recognize that guy? That's me, believe it or not. Yeah, I know what happened, okay? But I realized as I was writing this in the first person that it was also becoming something of an autobiography or a memoir. And not only how I got into archaeology and how I developed the interests I did, but even from the perspective of a single site, sort of the process you go through as an archaeologist when you have a new project area and you walk onto it for the first time, and what you see and what you're thinking and how you approach it. And I was writing that first person story. At the same time, I was writing something about the history of the Abenaki and their ancestors. And I just got comfortable with that. And so those 2 stories sort of go through the book and bounce off one another. I also talk about some of the difficulties and realities. This picture of me from 1985, this is in the center of Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm working on the Eddy site, where we had 2 meters of continuous layered deposits going back from 1,000 to 8,000 years before present. A really deeply stratified river floodplain site right on the edge of Route 293. And it was a little piece of a much larger site that had just miraculously survived all the development. Because if you look at downtown Manchester, this is right down from Amoskeag Falls, right down from where I was working, you see a scene of utter devastation, where this huge Native American site was pretty much obliterated because the waterfalls that drew them also made Manchester the center of the Industrial Revolution. And so I introduced the audience to some of the difficulties we face. The fact that so many of the pieces of the puzzle we're trying to build aren't there. And then the second chapter, it's a brief one, but I think it's an important one, because for people from outside the field, they're thinking, okay, you do archaeology on Indian sites. And one of the first questions I always get is, and it's always in the past tense, is what tribe were they? That's what people want to know. What tribe were they? And it's an interesting thing. People are looking for a name, and you can give them a name. You can say Abenaki, or if you're down here, you can say Wampanoag, and people say, oh, okay. And that suffices. But that doesn't really tell you much. And so in this chapter, I try to break that down a little bit and talk about, what do we mean when we say Abenaki? What does that mean in terms of language? Were the Abenaki people who had boundaries that separated them from the other native communities they lived next door to? And I think the answer there is very much no. One of the themes that I discovered as I was writing the book, I kept seeing the same things pop up over and over again. And one of them was a theme of connectedness, that the native people I'm studying did not live in societies with walls and borders, that they had ties, close ties, familial ties, linguistic ties, cultural ties to the people all around them. And you can see this in the archaeology, you can see it in the historic period. Lisa Brooks published a very detailed scholarly history of King Philip's War. And one of the things she's talking about in that book is how people from down here during the worst part of that war went up to the area around Keene, New Hampshire to seek refuge, because they knew those people, they were their kin, and they knew they'd take them in. And these connections really define a lot of what we see, I think, in the archaeology. And I try to move people away from this thinking about tribes as these unified, bounded things. And then I've got a chapter, because I'm using this metaphor, I guess, of the puzzle, finding the pieces, putting them together, seeing the big picture. But I want to acquaint our audience, and I'm talking to you as fellow archaeologists, I want to acquaint our audience with our evidence. What sort of things do we find? And what can we learn from it? What does it mean when we find stone tools and we're able to identify the quarry sources that they come from? How can that give us some insight into native life? In what ways do ceramic decoration or projectile point typologies change over time? And do we have any clue as to why these things change? And introducing people to the idea that these are good time markers and just sort of familiarizing themselves to them with the evidence. Talking about quarry sources like the Mount Jasper quarry up in Berlin and how far that stone is distributed. And also coming back to that theme in chapter 2 about the lack of boundedness here, and talking about the big world that the native people lived in here and how far they could travel with dugout canoes. One of the things that I ran into when I was doing my dissertation research years and years and years ago, I was reading, I think it was the letters of Roger Williams, and he had a mention of the Narragansett sachems getting into big dugout canoes at the head of Narragansett Bay and going all the way down the bay, all the way up Long Island Sound, and all the way up the Hudson River to Albany to go meet with the Mohawk. And if you think about that journey, which is a 500-mile round trip journey by canoe, and you think about native people using these kinds of watercraft for thousands of years, it gives you a sense, gave me a sense of the really big world that they lived in. And then I talk about 4 different sites that I've worked on in the Monadnock region. Each one of them has its own story. Each one of them has some interesting points to take from it. I do not do this chronologically, and this is not a book that's meant to be a comprehensive archaeology. I'm not talking about everything. I'm not talking about every time period. I just present 4 sites and the way we excavated them and studied them and what we learned. So the first site is the first one that I worked on when I first started teaching at Franklin Pierce. It's the Swansea Fish Dam site. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. And what it is a V-shaped stone dam in the Ashuelot River. You can see a photograph of it there in a newspaper article from 1950. And the first Europeans who came to this part of New Hampshire in the mid-18th century saw this dam and referred to it as the Old Indian Dam. Somehow they connected it with native people. And the idea behind the dam is that the V points downstream, so that in the spring, the migrating schools of fish like alewives, blueback herring, shad, etc., as they're coming up these drainages to spawn, they're going to hit the point of that V, and it's going to funnel them right over close to shore, where they can be netted and speared. That's the theory about how they would work. But when I first started studying this, I met a certain amount of skepticism and resistance, because these sorts of things had not been archaeologically well documented, especially in northern New England. And the problem was, how do you take a bunch of stones that are underwater and prove that they were made by Native Americans and get some kind of age on them? And really the only way you can do that, I think, is to excavate on the land immediately adjacent to that. And so we worked there on and off for 9 years with my Franklin Pierce students, actually 11 years with my Franklin Pierce students, and found diagnostic artifacts, big areas of fire-cracked rock where I think fish were being smoked and dried. And the artifacts and the radiocarbon dates put the first use of this dam at 4,000 years ago. And it was still in use when the Europeans came. But even more than that 4,000 year span, this is a remarkable part of New Hampshire from the standpoint of Native history. When we would park our van and walk down a power line corridor to get to this site, we would walk right over the Whipple Paleoindian site, because it's just to the north of this. And so you start by walking over a site that's upwards of 12,000 years old. and then you just march down the river a little bit, and then you're getting things from this time period. It's one of these places like this area right here that was continuously occupied for the entire span of the pre-contact era. And our work here helped show that this really was a part of the native landscape. So very interesting site from that perspective. Then I go to sort of a more mundane site, and still it's a neat little site, but just sort of an average day in the life site. And this is a site in the town of Peterborough, New Hampshire, which is on the Contoocook River, which is part of the Merrimack River drainage, but it's well up on a tributary of the Contoocook. And what we have here is a little knoll in the middle of the woods overlooking a small stream, the Nubanusset River, and a big area of wetlands. The kind of place that was really good for hunting and gathering people to come and do their work. And so excavating this, we found diagnostic tools and radiocarbon dates that put the first occupation of the site back about 5,000 years ago. And then it was, occupied sporadically for the next 3,000 years or so. Not as a habitation site. This is not a place where people are living and staying overnight. It's a place where people are coming for a day or an afternoon and doing the work that they're doing. We found a lot of calcined bone. We had it analyzed by Tanya Largy and some of her colleagues. And we had beaver, not surprisingly, and 3 different species of turtle. And even to this day, it's sort of a traditional joke among the Abenaki that if you're out in the woods working during the summer months and your kids are getting underfoot, you tell them to go hunt turtles because it's fun, it's productive. Turtles are edible, the shells make wonderful containers. And so we were able to see a place where small groups of people would spend a day. But that, of course, is part of a larger system. And where did these people go at night? This past year during COVID, because we live very close to here, next town over from Peterborough, and my wife and I would, from time to time, we'd go out to Peterborough, we get some takeout food, and we'd go and sit in a little park. And the little park is right where the Nubanusset flows into the Contoocook River. Beautiful confluence. And it's fairly level terrain. And we'd take our food and sit at the one picnic table there. And my poor wife, because every time I'd say the same thing, I said, look at this spot. Can you imagine the site that was here? The only problem was in the 1860s, they built a railroad through it. And there were sewer pipes and underground utilities and building foundations, and there's nothing left. The place that was really the center of this system is gone. And if we're going to learn anything about it, we've got to go a couple miles upstream and look at little sites like that. And that's a problem that I think we face all over New England. The third site that I looked at was another really interesting one. This is in the very southwestern corner of New Hampshire. We worked on this in 2004 and 2005. And where we are right here, so this is the Connecticut River. And we are on the edge of the river on the New Hampshire side on a tiny little sliver of terrace that is still hanging on, but rapidly falling into the Connecticut River. And on the topo map, this is Wentasticate Mountain right here. You can see the steep slope, and we are right at the base of that. Now, what this site had been, and I have 2 topographic maps here, one from 1893 and then another from the 1980s. On the 1893 map, you see these 2 large islands. These were originally attached to the New Hampshire side of the river. We can tell that because the soil is the same as it is on the New Hampshire side. And this would have been a big, level, sandy alluvial terrace coming right out into the river. Perfect place to have a site. And then over the next 70 or 80 years, between the construction of the Vernon Dam downstream and the 1938 hurricane, those islands are pretty much gone. And the only thing left of this landform is this tiny little strip of land clinging onto the edge of the mountain. So we worked here for 2 summers to try and get the artifacts that were here. This was a nice stratified site. We had deposits going down about 1.5 meters, going from about 700 years in age to over 5,000 years in age. We had all sorts of diagnostic artifacts, and we're finding some really well-preserved small vertebrae. And when we took these and turned them over to Tanya Largy, she looked at them, she said, these are all snakes. And she enlisted the help of one of her colleagues, Van Wallach, who's one of the top world authorities on snake anatomy. And Van was able to identify 5 different species of snake from this site. Okay? And 2 of them were venomous, including the northern copperhead. We had 1 vertebra. And then we had over 20 vertebrae of the eastern timber rattlesnake. Right? And this was not just from 1 snake, because these were distributed all the way down through the stratigraphic sequence. And to this day, Wentasticket Mountain is one of the last places in New Hampshire that has a viable population of timber rattlers. And so we have the native people here for thousands of years coming to this spot. And one of the things they're doing is going up to the top of Wentasticket, because that's where the snakes are, and hunting the snakes. But then what do you make of this? Because snakes are eaten as food. And we also know that snakes were sacred animals to a lot of Native American cultures. And so which was it at Wentasticket? And one of the things I try to discuss in this chapter is the difficulty archaeologists have in answering questions like that. But it's a neat site in that it brings you to that sort of question and lets you think about it. And then the final site I talk about in the book is the one for me that will almost certainly be the site of a lifetime. Well, maybe not. I could have a really interesting summer next year. But this was an absolutely spectacular site. And again, I know many people here are familiar with it or have at least heard of it. It was discovered back in 2009 before the construction of a new middle school in Keene, New Hampshire. And they were required to do a Section 106 study, and I was hired as the consultant to do that. And the site was on a high sandy terrace overlooking a big area of wetlands called Tenant Swamp. So nice place for a native site. And to cut to the chase, what we discovered were 4 beautifully defined concentrations of Paleoindian artifacts. Each one of these concentrations having a very distinct oval shape. And it was easy to interpret this, and this historic photograph from northern Quebec is sort of the model, as a place where people had come and set up these 4 tents and spent what we are fairly sure was a winter here. And then at the end of the winter, they took down their tents and left. And of course, what was left behind was all the debris left on the floor of their tent. So you have these nice tent-shaped clusters of artifacts. We had a line of stone that helped us define where the wall of the tent would be. A remarkable clarity to be able to see this. And we had calcined bone identified as caribou and otter. Again, thanks to Tanya Largy, you can tell who does all this work for me. And we had a radiocarbon date from some of that burned bone that came back at 12,600 years before present. There really is no older dated site in New England, and only a couple that might be from this time period. So a remarkable chance to see, in essence, the very first people to come into this part of the world. And it was a great site in terms of the interpretive value, the historic value, but it's also one where I got to talk about Section 106. Because for a lot of people in the public, they may have heard about that process. They know that sometimes archaeological studies are required, but they don't know why. And some people have this idea that, oh, the federal government has this huge overreaching power and they can make you do archaeology whenever they feel like it. So I use this as an opportunity to talk about when that happens, why it happens, and what the limits are. So even though we found this spectacular site here, the school ended up being constructed. But one of the parts of the mitigation plan for the school was that there be a public education component, that we take all the information we learn and we bring it not only to the community in the Keene area, I mean, it's the taxpayers that paid for this, but we also bring it into the schools. And so when this beautiful school was opened in September of 2011, a month after it opened, I went in and gave a talk to the entire student body, hundreds of middle schoolers in the cafeteria. And then I've been back every fall since. I give a talk to the incoming 6th graders. And the teachers have taken this information, they've incorporated it into their science and social studies curriculum. They have raised money to build an educational boardwalk that includes information on the Paleoindian site. And I tried to use that also as a way of saying to people, there's real benefit here. There's real public benefit, enduring benefit from thinking about historic resources and doing this sort of work. So that is the oldest of my sites, but it's the last of the 4 that I discuss. And then I sort of head toward the finish line with the book. And in the second to last chapter, because I don't want this to stop with the archaeological record, because it is very easy, of course, for people to think, okay, the Indians are part of the past. And white people came here and they died off or went away, and that's all there is to it. So I talk a little bit about the historic experience of the Abenaki and how they got caught up in the French and Indian Wars. Caught up, they were active participants in it. Their alliance with the French, the presence of Abenaki communities in Quebec that still exist to this day, and how Abenaki people in New Hampshire and Vermont managed to survive for the next 200 years in the face of things like eugenics and discrimination and things of that sort. And one of the remarkable stories I tell, and this is the picture of this young woman is on the cover of the book. This is Elizabeth Sedekis. This is her high school graduation photo from 1916. And in Keene, there is this remarkable story of the Sedekis family. They were Abenaki who had been living at the Abenaki village up in Odenak, Quebec. And in the 1880s, Israel Sedekis and his wife, Mary, decided they were going to move. They got in a canoe, took it down the Connecticut River, and wound up settling in, of all places, Keene, New Hampshire. They had 12 children. Israel had a successful business making baskets, a very traditional Abenaki occupation. And his children went on to become very prominent, owned a millinery shop, served in the military. 2 of his daughters, including Elizabeth, were quite possibly the first Native American registered nurses in the United States. And so it's a remarkable story of the continuity of the Abenaki into the 19th century, into the 20th century, as part of the landscape of this region. And then the very final photograph in the book is of my friend Sherry Gould, who's a master Abenaki basket maker. And this is a picture of Sherry from just a couple of years ago, teaching this traditional craft at a history event in Hillsborough. And so that sort of brings us all the way through the entire span of Abenaki history. And so that's the book cover. And like I said, the book came out on October 11th. I have been very busy, and I've never been a book author before. So it's been a learning curve for me. And so one of my jobs I found out was I need to promote it. I need to talk about it. And so this is, I was counting them, I think this is today is the 30th event since October 11th that I have done surrounding the book. It's been busy, okay? And they've been all over the place, all kinds of events. The first one was really remarkable. It was held at the Historical Society of Cheshire County, one of my partners, and they had a big room. And because of COVID limitations, they limited it to 80 and sort of spaced the chairs out. So we had 80 people in the room and over 200 people on Zoom come in to see the launch of this book. Marge Grushak joined us via Zoom at the beginning, and she and her husband sang an Abenaki welcome song to sort of kick the event off. And it was a real high. I was like, oh, this is amazing. Look at all these people. Look at this interest. The very next night, I had a Zoom presentation for the public library in Pepperell, Massachusetts. That one had 9 people. One of them was a 10-year-old boy who kept getting up and wandering off to go do whatever it is 10-year-old boys do. But it's been all sorts of events like that, big and small, and it has been a really enjoyable journey. Now, I had said toward the beginning that we were worried okay, about whether the book was going to sell, and how many of these my granddaughters would have to clean out of my basement. Yeah. So we did an initial, we went for broke. We did an initial print run of 2,000 copies. As of this morning, there were 70 left at the distributor. Okay, and we are going to a second printing in January. So it has been very successful. There really has been. And I thank you for inviting me down here to be able to talk about it. But I think, again, and to go back to this business about telling stories, these are stories that people care about, whether you have Native ancestry or you don't. People like to know about the places they live. And if, as archaeologists, we tell these stories for them, I think they will be very responsive. And so I'm hoping to see more and more of this sort of thing done. I have a whole list of people here who contributed in different ways. These are all pulled from the acknowledgements. So there they are right there. But you can see them in there if you want. So I'll go back to that. And that is the story of my book, my work in the area. And I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any questions. Thank you. Yes, in the back. Yeah.
Bob, this is kind of a personal reading for me. That happened. I'm so pleased to see you. You don't remember me, but I remember you. Our paths crossed some years ago for one day.
Okay.
You were that skinny kid.
Yes.
In photo.
Okay.
And I was a skinnier guy, younger, trying to raise a couple kids. And this morning you say you're a grandfather. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Grandfather back then.
Oh, thank you.
Our paths crossed the Lambert Farm site.
Yes.
Down East Greenwich Forward.
Yep.
Shelvings.
Yep.
That site was being destroyed at the time, going to be destroyed due to housing development. If I get it right or wrong, correct. Public archaeology lab, elements of Brown University, and I think you were Brown. Collaborated to go in a short period of time and utilize public for excavation. Students, public. I'm one of the public guys.
Nice to see you
What an
again.
opportunity for this guy. I was able to learn from Dr. Jordan for 3 credits from that field school. The square that I was given to one day to advise a young lady had never excavated in her life. When we got down through the loom, I said to my charge, you go, you get in. So we were in the top level, below the loom. She found, you may remember or you may not, a Fox Creek Jasper point. You were on the site and you created quite a stir.
I was, yes.
Because you were writing a paper about the trade pattern of Jasper. And there was quite a bit of excitement.
Quite a bit of excitement, yeah.
So I'll end this, but I could ramble on.
Thank you. Yeah, for the folks on Zoom, yeah, we're talking about the Lambert Farm site that we both worked on. Yeah.
But when you talk about the interconnectedness of the different peoples going great distances, interacting, I have no doubt that and your work with the Jasper bolsters and proves that point, that these peoples, these ancient peoples were interconnected and interacting. I'll shut up now, but it's so nice to see you again.
Oh, thank you.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That site, we've been talking about the Lambert Farm site in Warwick, Rhode Island, that we worked on many years ago. And one of the things I remember, one of the things I talk about in this book is I have less and less patience with saying archaeology can only be a science, or drawing these lines between how we talk about these things. Science is important. Don't get me wrong. Love science. But we can also use that to think about people as people and to take sort of a more humanistic approach to them. And one of the things from the Lambert Farm site that I will never forget is remarkable. And if people ask me, what is the single neatest thing you ever found? I think this might qualify. Now, this is a site, it was mostly woodland period, middle and late woodland. And we had these big pits filled with shell. So the native people are harvesting shellfish, throwing the shell and other debris in pits. And typically you've got all kinds of, you've got quahogs and oysters and soft shell clams are all sort of mixed together with broken pieces of pottery. But I remember one feature from Lambert Farm that was different. It was a meter deep pit filled with shell. Only in this pit, the shell was stratified by species. So you've got a layer of quahog, a layer of soft shell clam, a layer of scallop, just weird. Okay. And we got to the bottom when the shell ran out, and at the bottom was a perfectly flat stone, okay, a meter down, and mapped it and photographed it and lifted the stone up. And underneath the stone was the completely articulated skeleton of a puppy with a whelk shell next to its head. Okay. It is really hard for me not to sort of go back and put myself in and understand the folks who were doing that. So yeah, that brings back a lot of memories. So thank you. Other questions? Yes, Al.
I saw on the picture of Tenant Swamp, you had the gravers down there as the only artifact on that.
Yep.
And at Bullbrook, you got hundreds and hundreds of gravers there.
Yeah.
What are we doing with all these gravers, and what's your interpretation of that?
Yeah, the question is, so why were there so many gravers at Bullbrook, and why do we see these different patterns in tool use? And I think, obviously it reflects activities to some extent. I think it also reflects seasonality. And one of the things about the Tenant Swamp Site is we had 216 stone tools from the Paleoindian period. Only 2 of them were related to hunting. We had 2 little broken fragments of fluted points. That was it. But we had dozens of scrapers, all with use wear from hide scraping, which I think is consistent maybe with an occupation during the worst part of the winter, right? When you're living on stored food and there's not a lot of hunting activity that's going on. But yeah, that's the question you ask. And that's one of the neat things about archaeology is you dig a site, you find these artifacts, you look at them, you see a pattern, the pattern leads to a question. You do other research to answer the question, then you've got other questions coming from that. It's an unending process. So yeah. Yes.
We have a question from Zoom,
Yeah.
and that is from Joseph. Do you have any theories as to how Native Americans arrived here in New England some 13,000 years ago?
Do I have any theories about how Native people got here some 13,000 years ago? I don't specifically, and one of the things I'm sometimes grateful for is that because of what we know about the glaciation here, we don't have to wrestle as much as people do in other areas with the possibility of pre-fluted point occupations here. I have no particular theory about that. I mean, just given the terrain, I'm guessing they come from the west and or the south. And I suspect they come in not as part of an intentional long distance journey to get to a place they've never been, but simply reflecting the success of these populations. And as their numbers grow, their frontier expands. And so we know by 12,600 years ago, they're here in New Hampshire. One of the things that's striking, especially, and this does not answer the question, that's a good question. But one of the things that's striking is when people get here, it's not as if they're absolute newcomers to this place. Because the people in Keene, all of the stone that they're using is coming from quarry sources that are somewhere between 120 and 350 miles distant. And they're in northern New England. And so at the very beginning, they've got these connections that are pulling in these resources over a very broad area. So it was a complex system that first came here. And that again that's as close as I'll come to a theory. So other questions?
I'm sorry, I just have a question. Actually, I was a friend of Frank James Longsaddle, who was an acquittal one for the land, and he started that National Day of Mourning back in I see John Peters up here, so I'm sure I do. But my question is, I had heard that the Wampanoag and Narragansett, maybe there was a conflict at some, and I'm wondering if in your archaeological digs or studies, you ever found evidence, archaeological evidence of conflict between different groups.
The question is, have I seen, and again, looking back to, we know in the 17th century, there was real conflict between the Narragansett and Wampanoag, particularly after the pandemic, when the Narragansett began pushing into Wampanoag territory. That seems to be pretty well documented. So the question was, is there evidence for that sort of conflict before that? In my part of the world, not that I have seen. I haven't seen any evidence for that. We don't have, any evidence of, say, skeletons with trauma that looks like, they suffered violent death. One of the sites that I talk about, though, in the book is the Fort Hill site. And the Fort Hill site was occupied during a single year in the 1670s. It's in Hinsdale, New Hampshire, and it is in a really strange location. It is set back from the river. And it is up on a high, it's almost like a mesa, a very strange landform, flat topped with steep slopes on each side. And it was chosen because it was defensible. And the Sakoki Abenaki in the 1670s went up there, they built a palisaded fort. And we have good historic documentation. Pete Thomas did a wonderful excavation there. We know a lot about that site. And that is clearly a defensible location built by people who are in fear of attack. I don't see any evidence for that prior to European contact, none. Now, I don't mean we don't want to fall into the trap of saying life was blissful, life was simple. I mean, these are human beings, life is complicated, but no archaeological evidence that says war is part of that reality. Yes. Yeah.
Just to add to what you were saying to answer this gentleman's question, that during there was conflict, if you will, between the Narragansett and the Wampanoag after the plague, but we believe that it was in the form of a negotiation where the Narragansett were trying to get tribute from Massasoit or other Wampanoag people that lived along the Narragansett Wampanoag border, if you will, and that there was no actual fighting. As because our way of dealing with conflict is very different from Western society, and it didn't get to that point.
It's a very complicated landscape during that period. You have all sorts of things going on. I mean, you not only have contact, which has been going on since the early 1500s, you have the pandemic in 1616 to 1617 that does so much damage to so many native societies. And you have these native societies caught up in their own ambitions and agendas and strategies and so on and so forth. There's another story from Hinsdale in the early mid 1700s. There's a gentleman named Ebenezer Hinsdale, who was a Harvard trained minister who, after graduating from Harvard, as far as we can tell, never preached a day in his life, but he went out to the frontier to try to make some money. And he opened a trading post in what would become Hinsdale, named after him. And he traded with everybody, the native people, the French, the English, whoever wanted to do trade. He had another trading post down in Deerfield. And so in the mid 17th century, you have Abenaki people interacting with Hinsdale at his trading posts. And when Hinsdale would go from one trading post to the other, the one he was not at would be run by his African slave. And so that early on in history, you have people from 3 different continents managing an international trade. It was a complicated landscape. So, yes.
We have another question
Yep.
from Zoom. What is the most interesting site in Massachusetts, or maybe wherever you've ever dug, that you worked on?
Yeah. What was the last of the?
So what's the most interesting site you've worked on?
Yeah, I would say without a doubt, it would be the Tenant Swamp Site, the Paleoindian site in Keene. Simply because it was so well preserved. There was evidence from only one occupation. You just had this tremendous clarity. You could learn all sorts of things. But there are other sites I could point to. And one of the things that I've really become a great fan of is little sites. And I mean little, not large in area, and little, not a whole lot of artifacts, but little sites that are the remains of a single moment in time, where a small group of people came, camped, maybe just for an evening, so that everything you're looking at is from that moment. Because so many of our sites, if you look at all the incredible artifacts out in this museum, they're covered from these rich multi-component sites where you've got 7,000 or 8,000 years worth of artifacts all churned together in a fairly shallow soil strata. But if you find these little sites, these little campsites from an evening, you can really hone in on that moment. And you can see things that you can't see at the other sites. So another interesting site I worked on that I talked about in the book is a site in Dalton, New Hampshire on the Connecticut River, where we actually have good evidence for a child practicing stone tool making. And that's something that you're not able to see in a much larger and richer site. Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much. Thank you folks on Zoom. And thank you for having me here and for supporting the book.
If anyone's interested in purchasing the book in the front, you can be clearly there, the 28 plus tax. And Bob is willing to stay and sign them, so you get an opportunity to buy and enhance its value. The first edition is almost sold out.
We go from $28 to $28.10. Now is the time to act, okay?
But let me skip share for you.
Okay.